Welcome to Pod Save America. I'm Jon Favreau.
I'm Jon Lovett.
I'm Tommy Vietor.
Later in the pod, Lovett talks to Hawaii Senator Brian Schatz about the fight over the next economic relief bill and the 2020 Senate map. Before that, we'll talk about what might have been the series finale of the Daily Trump Show, the growing panic among Republicans over the November election, and Joe Biden's homebound campaign. But first, Lovett, how was the show this week?
We had a great Love It or Leave It. John Hodgman came by and judged the monologue, which was a delight. Akilah Hughes, egged on by Travis Helwig, quizzed Ronan and I on our relationship, Ronan and me, in a way that tried to get us to break up. And we talked to Katie Porter,
Star-studded.
who we love, about what's happening in Congress. So it was a great episode. We talked to listeners. It was a nice break from everything. So check it out.
We also have a big announcement today. Crooked Media has partnered with Pineapple Street Studios and Spotify to bring you a brand new limited series podcast called Wind of Change, an original series hosted by investigative journalist Patrick Radden Keefe. The show begins when Patrick hears a rumor from inside the CIA that Wind of Change, the very popular power ballad by the Scorpions that was an anthem for the end of the Cold War, was actually written by the CIA. This series is Patrick's journey to find the truth. The trailer is out now on Spotify. Follow Wind of Change on Spotify to binge all 8 episodes on May 11th. Exciting,
I just
huh?
have to say, we've been working on this show with Patrick for the better part of a year. I've gotten to know him. I've read all his work forever. He's one of the best journalists in journalism, period. His book last year, Say Nothing, was one of the best books I've ever read. And this story is incredible. I've literally thought about it ever since the first day he pitched it. And to hear this thing finally come to life is so exciting. It is such a fun journey. It'll be a great break from coronavirus hell. Subscribe to Wind of Change. Do it on Spotify. Then you can binge it. It's going to be great.
I'll start with what might be some good news. After being subjected to Donald Trump's hours-long White House briefings nearly every day for the last 2 months, the country may be getting a break. Trump held no briefing on Saturday or Sunday, canceled it today, and White House aides say they may be cutting back the president's appearances. That's the good news. The bad news is that it's because the president suggested a cocktail of sunlight and disinfectant might cure COVID. Let's take a listen to what happened on last week's briefing.
Supposing we hit the body with a tremendous, whether it's ultraviolet or just very powerful light, and I think you said that hasn't been checked, but you're going to test it. And then I said, supposing you brought the light inside the body, which you can do either through the skin or in some other way. And I think you said you're going to test that too. Sounds interesting. Right, and then I see the disinfectant where it knocks it out in a minute, 1 minute. And is there a way we can do something like that by injection inside or almost a cleaning? Because you see it gets on the lungs and it does a tremendous number in the lungs. So it'd be interesting to check that. So that you're going to have to use medical doctors with. But it sounds interesting to me. So we'll see. But the whole concept of the light, the way it kills it in 1 minute, that's pretty powerful.
So, Tommy, I don't want to dwell too much on this story since it's been covered quite thoroughly, but Trump later said he was being sarcastic. Is that how people took it?
Trump is that friend we've all had who says something really shitty to you and then pretends he was kidding. He's like, come on, what, I was kidding. They're like, your haircut looks like Neil Patrick Harris got stranded on a desert island. What? He's being funny. That's what my wife said to me.
That's what's happening to you. Yeah, right.
Hannah said to you, drink bleach. I'm just kidding.
So we had some fun with that. When you're the president, it's less fun. I mean, in this case, Trump suggested that, I guess, like getting a sunshine enema or drinking bleach could cure you of the coronavirus, because we all know, the way HIV goes away is you get a tan. And it ended up having people calling poison hotlines. The Surgeon General had to clarify on Twitter. Clorox and Lysol were putting out statements. And so again, like, the stated rationale for broadcasting these coronavirus task force briefings live is that viewers will get important medical information. And again, we're seeing that's not happening. I mean, anyone who watched this comment knows he was not being sarcastic, because we have eyes. And also, who tries out some jokes at the pandemic response briefing? That's not the right venue. So anyway, of course he wasn't kidding. It's ridiculous.
Yeah, it would be funnier if it wasn't like if all of these states weren't getting calls through their hotlines about people actually thinking this could be a fucking cure. I mean,
Well,
Lovett,
there's also some useful information there. Like, it does seem like direct sunlight and humidity can help kill the virus outside, and maybe that's good to know. Maybe we all shouldn't hang out inside. We should hang out outside. But all that information is washed away by him saying this crazy nonsense.
Well, Lovett, it does seem like this is part of a larger pattern where Trump just completely contradicts his own public health experts. His CDC director said the virus could be even worse in the fall and winter. Trump said then it might not come back at all. Dr. Fauci says we need to do a lot more testing. Trump said last week he disagrees with them, that we're doing great on testing. They demoted the doctor in charge of developing a vaccine last week because the guy refused to promote Trump's favorite unproven treatment, hydrochloroquine. What's the danger here for Trump? There's the danger for us.
What's the
which we just talked
danger?
about. What's the danger?
Yeah, so a couple things. So one, Birx. So one thing that happens after this is every serious health official associated with this administration goes on television in the next day or two and doesn't say 5 or 6 important things people ought to know. They say, "Oh, here's what Trump meant. Yeah, I heard that." Birx was asked, like, what was Trump talking about? And she's desperate to try to make sure people don't drink bleach while also not being too contradictory, because that ends up coming back on you, tenfold in the form of Trump insulting you, retweeting someone calling for you to be fired. And this is a person who has vacillated between just trying to do her job and being a bit of a Trump flunky. But she was making the point that Trump, he just had learned something and he was trying to think it through. And sometimes he thinks out loud. Like, obviously, that's incredibly irresponsible. It's incredibly irresponsible for the president to be thinking out loud about something he learned. Now, the thing he learned was sunlight may be the best disinfectant. An old saying that is just sort of common wisdom about the ways, the way sunlight may help us in this situation. He was learning some basic information. Now, the damage it does, one of the things that was striking is that this whole question of will the virus come back in the fall or not, right? And Fauci says, probably, we don't know, but looks like we should be prepared for a combo flu season, COVID season. That seems like where we're probably heading. And Trump says, well, maybe, but maybe not. Maybe it will go away. It doesn't matter. This is a silly and stupid prediction debate. We should be preparing. This is very simple. Like, a legitimate president would say, I'm a bit more optimistic because that's my nature. But the scientists tell me we need to be ready for it coming back. And so we're going to be ready for it to come back. We'll hope for the best and prepare for the worst. But we end up in these endless loops that are not about the best way to respond to this growing pandemic, but actually the axis of debate is only about Trump. Was he right? Was he wrong? Is he smart? Is he dumb? Is he helping himself? Is he hurting himself? Is he lying? Is he telling the truth? And we do that over and over and over again. And that means that I think in like a lot of ways, like, forget the like specific information, the cultural societal response to this virus is confused in large part because this incredibly important podium is so thoroughly misused. That's all.
Yeah, I mean, look, from the public's perspective, we've seen in every poll since the beginning of this that they trust public health officials and experts far more than they trust Donald Trump. And that's been even more true the longer this goes on. And so as he continues to contradict a number of people that the public trusts more than him, it makes him even less credible in the eyes of the public during a pandemic that goes on, in which he seems to always be looking, as you said, Lovett, for like the easiest way out. Everything is like, he wants the miracle cure. He wants it not to come back in the fall. He thinks everything's gonna be fine. And like, it's this just debilitating short-termism on his part, where he just wants to get through that news cycle. But like, that doesn't work that well as the pandemic drags on. What happens if it comes back in the fall and the winter? And everyone's like, oh, Donald Trump told us it wouldn't be back. It's only going to be worse for him,
Yeah. I mean, but he just knows that, like, if it does come back in the fall, everyone will say, you told us it was going to be better. And he'll say, no, I didn't. And he'll just lie about it again. My favorite thing of the day is the New York Post reporting that's being regurgitated on Fox News this morning that Trump is just working so hard that he's skipping lunch sometimes. And, as you can tell by looking at the guy, he's not exactly wasting away. It's like so ridiculous. I mean, I believe, like, whatever staffer decided last night to pitch every single reporter on a new strategy that involves less time for Trump at the podium and more of a focus on economic issues, I believe that person. I believe that's what they want. I believe they think that's smart. I don't believe for a second Donald Trump is going to give up that podium, because as a human, he's a broken narcissist and he's desperate for praise and affirmation. But as president, like, this seems like his main activity for the week every week, right? He doesn't attend the coronavirus task force meetings themselves. That's how you get a scenario where he like half hears some briefing and decides to riff on the healing powers of ingesting bleach. He just watches TV all morning, gets mad, tweets, and then rages on reporters in the briefing. Like, I literally don't know what he'll do with his time if he's not at these events.
Well,
I also want to just be clear here. You know, there have been a lot of people saying that the cable networks are wrong to take these briefings live. And now that we know that they may be politically toxic for Trump, and that's the only reason they're considering not airing them, I want to once again continue to urge CNN and MSNBC and Fox to carry these briefings live. It is their obligation. We need to see what the president is saying every day.
Well, that was going to be my next question. I mean, you know, we have worried that these briefings are sort of artificially propping up his approval ratings because they're nothing but propaganda. It's clear now they're either not doing that or they're having the opposite effect. Why do you think that is? I mean, Tommy, Navigator's daily tracking poll had Trump's approval at 47-49 a month ago. Now has him at 42 approve, 56% disapprove, which is the worst rating he's had in a month. Why do you think the briefings have been pushing things the other way?
I mean, look, we should stipulate that, I mean, maybe the briefings are unrelated to his polling, right?
True.
I mean,
Right.
Early on, there was a rally around the flag effect for every leader in the world. Trump got less of a bump from that sort of impact, and it went away faster. It's also clear that things have gotten way worse just on the ground in everyone's lives. Like, the global death toll is over 200,000. The financial impact is mounting. It's been devastating. I do think, though, as president, and we've seen this in polling for Trump on other issues like China, sometimes you get credit just for looking active and seeming like you're on top of something. You get credit for trying. But I do think, like, as people get impatient, as their lives get worse, as you round 6 weeks without leaving your house, the briefings strike you a different way. You can tell he's making mistakes, and then, like, saying something like this drink bleach comment, like, that jumps out and becomes part of a national conversation that includes SNL and like late night shows and all the places that might not otherwise be talking about the coronavirus task force briefing. And I think it compounds the problem because people don't believe him. They want to hear from scientists, and they think he's chaotic and not necessarily in charge.
Lovett, what do you think?
To Tommy's point about not knowing how the briefing is really affecting this one way or another, I do think because we're in the thick of it, it's hard to know the relationship between, Trump's blundering and the biases that a lot of people who might be sympathetic or prone to voting for Trump, like kind of older white voters, how that is kind of running headlong into the fact that these are people who are most at risk and most afraid of what this virus could do to their families, themselves, their communities. We talked about this when this first started, that Trump plays on people's emotions. That's what he does. He plays on their fears and he plays on their worst instincts. But that is sort of, it's hard for that to be a match for the scale of what we're facing. This is a global pandemic. It is affecting every corner of the country. It is making people afraid and closed off from one another and insecure and uncertain, with a whole bunch of economic calamity on top of that. And so his usual bag of tricks feel completely insufficient for this moment. And so, he can try all he wants. He can, retweet a Joe Biden deepfake. He can attack the Nobel Prize. He can go to the briefing, not go to the briefing. He's at war with reality, and that's not something he can win.
Yeah, I mean, I think people are getting tired of the Trump show in the middle of a pandemic. 23% now trust what he says about the coronavirus, just incredibly low when you consider that his base is like 35 to 40% of the population. It's from an AP poll. Navigator has 63% of people say that self-absorbed applies to Trump's response. 57% say the response has been chaotic. 56% say erratic and irresponsible. Axios did a focus group of Obama-Trump voters in Ohio. And I thought it was interesting because they all said that they wished he would act more like their Republican governor, Mike DeWine. And sort of the conclusion from the focus group, what a lot of the voters were saying is there's a little appetite for partisan politics among these voters when it comes to a crisis with life and death consequences. They want a leader who will work with health and science experts, find solutions, and activate in a way that won't polarize the country. So, of course, his move when things aren't going well for him is to blame people and try to divide people against each other. And like you said, Lovett, all these little tricks, right? Like everything is a game. He's mad about everything. He's yelling at the media and all of that stuff. Like a lot of people don't tolerate that in normal times, and they're really not tolerating it in the middle of a pandemic and an economic crisis.
Yeah.
So because of Trump's political problems, Republicans are starting to act like Democrats and panicking. According to the New York Times, quote, Republicans were taken aback this past week by the results of a 17-state survey commissioned by the Republican National Committee. It found the president struggling in the Electoral College battlegrounds and likely to lose without signs of an economic rebound this fall, according to a party strategist outside the RNC who's familiar with the poll's results. Times also notes that a recent wave of polling that showed Republican senators in Arizona, Colorado, North Carolina, and Maine trailing or locked in a dead heat with potential Democratic rivals.
I'm recording.
Tommy,
right
should we allow ourselves to enjoy this news? Do we think the Senate's more in play than it was, and why?
I mean, look, these polls are good news for Biden generally. We'll start with Biden. So it's not just national polls that have him winning and that don't end up meaning much when applied to the Electoral College. These are real leads in state polls in Florida, Michigan, Pennsylvania, states he really needs to win. Trump's trying to go on offense places. And Minnesota is like the only state they've really targeted for a pickup. And that's not looking good. I think he's down 10 there. So we're lucky that we have great Senate candidates on top of that. And they've been fundraising well. But I don't think anyone should get cocky here. I mean, the best thing that listeners can do is pick a Senate race or two, promote the hell out of those candidates on social media. Maybe you set up a recurring donation, give them $5 a month because that adds up and really matters. But, I'm going to let myself feel hopeful. And I think we're going to talk more about the Biden campaign and what is and isn't working. But, Sarah Gideon in Maine, Doug Jones in Alabama, Cal Cunningham in North Carolina, Mark Kelly in Maine, Gary Peters in Michigan, the Colorado race. We got to win a lot of those races and defend elsewhere to take back the Senate.
Lovett, I know you're going to talk to Brian Schatz about this in a little bit, but what do you think about this, the improving poll numbers for Democrats here?
I think they're horse shit. I'm not going to buy them. I'm not. Look, it's nice to see. I hope they're right. I hope it gives people a jolt to support their candidates. I think we should just continue to assume that winning back the Senate is hard and may get harder as we get closer to the fall. We don't know. We also just don't know how all of this will play out with the virus and how it affects turnout, which is, I think, just this big, flashing unknown. And so beyond that, yes, I think it's it's heartening to see. It's hopeful. And we talked about this from the beginning too, that this virus was going to shift people's expectations, and the economic fallout would shift people's expectations of government, that people are going to turn to government and look for a well-run, active government that helps people in their time of crisis. And I think that lends itself to voters considering Democrats more than they might have otherwise. But beyond that, I think it's still so early.
One thing about the Senate is, we've been seeing in the last couple election cycles, this has just been a trend that's continued, is it's not as likely that when there's a competitive Senate race and a presidential race, the Senate race goes to one party and the presidential goes to another. So I think in 2016, like if Hillary won a state, then the senators who were competitive in that state, who were in competitive races, also won that state, Democratic candidates. If Trump won a state, then the Republican candidates who were competitive. So the Senate's much more closely linked to the presidential race. So you would expect now, if Trump is having some problems, then the Republican candidates in those states are also going to have problems. I also think, by the way, that like we've talked for a long time about how winning the Senate back has been incredibly important, but I do think it's probably even more important now because of the pandemic and the economic fallout, as we heard from Mitch McConnell last week. Like, if Joe Biden wins the presidency and Mitch McConnell is still the Senate Majority Leader, I do not think anyone should expect any more economic relief, stimulus, anything to come out of that Senate. Mitch McConnell is going to fucking put the brakes on any more stimulus, and he's going to rerun the play that he ran when Obama took office amid the Great Recession. It's just abundantly clear. And so I do see winning back the Senate almost as important as winning back the presidency when it comes to digging us out of this economic crisis. All right, let's talk about our fellow podcast host, Joe Biden. Over the weekend, the New York Times and the Washington Post published a pair of deep dives into how the former vice president's campaign is adapting to the pandemic. He and Dr. Biden are holed up in their house with very few staff. He's doing Zoom fundraisers and virtual rope lines. He's calling volunteers and first responders to thank them. And he's doing hours of policy briefings about the coronavirus response each day. This has reportedly been a tough adjustment for Biden, who truly does love one-on-one campaigning. It's also fueled concern among some Democrats that the Biden folks aren't doing enough to steal the spotlight from Trump. All that said, Harry Anton wrote a piece over at CNN Harry Anton wrote a piece for CNN over the weekend arguing that from a polling perspective, what he calls Biden's, quote, invisible campaign is actually working. And he points to some of the polls we just talked about, recent polls from Michigan, Florida, Pennsylvania, that show Biden with clear leads. And he argues that all the extra coverage is actually hurting Trump and helping Biden. Tommy, what do you think about this? Is Harry right? Is some of the worry overblown there?
I mean, I think Harry's right in that Trump tends to do worse when the focus of the media's attention is on him, right? I mean, ultimately, when he finally surged against Clinton, it's because we were wasting our time talking about her emails and Comey and all that bullshit. So it's a good contrarian point. It's a good pushback to all the people freaking out and saying, where's Biden? Why isn't he getting more coverage? Blah, 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 blah. That said, like, I don't think we should feel comfortable now, right? I mean, if this is a snapshot of the race in the midst of a pandemic where Trump is getting hammered every day for a failed government response. I think it's entirely about that and not really at all about Biden's campaign. So we know from some good reporting how he's trying to reach voters. They're doing cable hits, virtual events, virtual rope lines, strategic local TV interviews in swing states. Like, all those are very smart things. Is that message really penetrating? Are people seeing him where they need to see him? I just don't know. But I'm sure almost any campaign would tell you, like, they would like to do more. They would like to reach more people. And so some of the articles you mentioned, it does sound like Biden is spending a lot of the time every day prepping for the job of president, which obviously that's important. But if I were his staffer, I would probably argue, like, let's skip the economic briefing or national security briefing today and just spend another hour doing these local satellite hits in, North Carolina or whatever. I do think this thing is going to turn. No one can get cocky. Like, the press will get bored of talking about only the coronavirus. Trump will attack Biden. They will find a way to make it about him and drive down his numbers. So again, like, I do think a bit of this is on us. The easy things listeners can do is, like, follow Biden on YouTube, Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, like, post things about him, about the platform that you like be an influencer in your own little online community, donate a little bit of money if you can, because that's where we should all get really scared, is Trump's financial advantage. It is going to be hundreds of millions of dollars, and it could swamp any message from Biden.
Lovett, what do you think?
Part of this is we're in the middle of a pandemic that focuses on the people in charge, right? That's why we're talking about governors. That's why we're talking about Trump. So there's some part of it that just sort of exigent circumstances make it hard for Joe Biden to intercede. And I do think that they should be looking for places to make news. I think they are doing that. So some of this is just the reality of the situation. It does remind me a bit of what we were saying during the whole primary, where Joe Biden was doing fewer events than virtually any other candidate. And there was an argument made again and again, where's Joe Biden? How can he become the nominee if he's not doing as much, if he's not on the trail? And now here we are. He's the nominee. I do think what Tommy said about the money is really important. One thing I was thinking about, too, because the Biden campaign has been putting out ads and also, longer, like 1 minute, 2 minute, 3 minute videos telling a story about a policy, response, what have you. And they're excellent. And what's striking about them is when you take Joe Biden and you edit Joe Biden and you remove some of the halting phrases and some of the places where he's a bit meandering and tries to answer 3 questions at once, what you're left with is only the kind of it does more for Joe Biden than I think ads have done for other candidates, because what you're left with is just the pure best version of his message delivered by him, and it's really effective. So part of this too is I think getting them the resources they need to put a lot of money behind those ads is going to be increasingly important if he's campaigning from home.
Yeah, you can tell that, one indication that Harry's analysis is right is that it's bothering the Trump campaign that Biden isn't getting as much coverage because what they want to do is define Joe Biden before he can define himself. And what the Biden campaign seems to be doing is they think that a generic Democrat would beat Donald Trump in this environment because people are sick of Donald Trump. His approval ratings are falling, and they just basically want to be that generic Democrat. And the slight advantage Joe Biden has is, compared to many of the other people he ran against in the primary, some of the newer candidates, he is fairly well known. So unlike, say, John Kerry against George W. Bush in 2004, most people can identify Joe Biden. They know he was Barack Obama's president, so he has that baseline of people who know who he is. I do think, to your point, Tommy, there's still, that doesn't mean that they should rest on their laurels. This thing is fucking far from over and will turn a million more times. Jason Goldman, who was the chief digital officer in the Obama White House, he talked to Dan on Thursday. After he talked to Dan about some of this stuff, he wrote a Medium post that I think is really smart and everyone should go look at. He talked about how, Joe Biden is never going to catch up with Donald Trump in terms of followers on Twitter, YouTube, all these social media channels. But what he can be doing is sort of what he's doing in terms of local media on television, doing all these like local television interviews, but do it digitally. So he should be using existing channels with a large reach already to find persuadable voters that aren't sort of his own YouTube channel, his own Twitter feed, right? Like he did Desus and Mero on Showtime a couple weeks ago. It was great, right? Desus and Mero has an entire audience that Joe Biden will never reach with Joe Biden's own media channels, his Twitter and stuff like that. He could, I saw that his podcast is getting 40,000 downloads an episode in the Washington Post story. He could, for example, come on our podcast.
We reach a lot more than 40,000 people. Oh, he's getting 40,000 downloads.
So
he should probably, if he wanted to promote his podcast, he could probably come on this show.
That's what I'm saying. And then he never has to talk to us again. He just promotes his podcast. He'll get a bunch.
Because it's almost like doing his podcast 50 times.
Yeah, right. Like you don't have to match Trump's 73 million Twitter followers, but like do what AOC does and have conversations on Instagram Live or whatever with people who have big audiences. And, you guys are like half kidding about booking Biden on PSA, but like the best way you don't have time to build a huge podcast audience, and nor like that's not an end in and of itself. You're just trying to reach people. So if you're spending hours and hours and hours on a thing that's getting downloaded 40,000 times, that's probably not a better use of time than going on like Tim Ferriss's show. Right? Not about politics, does huge numbers. It's not people seeking out political views. You might reach Republican swing voters. Like there was a big dust up with Bernie and Joe Rogan. Like you can think his views are wrong. You can think they're offensive, but have a conversation with him, change his mind, push back on those views, and then reach that audience that otherwise will hear like a shittier, like alt-righty sounding conversation more often, right? Like I do think you have to get out of the bubble of people that are searching out political news or coronavirus news to reach new folks.
There was one study looked at sort of, Trump's hours and hours and hours and hours in the briefing room. And I think that the sum total of the moments in which he's expressed empathy for victims was something I think like was it 4.5 minutes, four and a half
it's
minutes
nothing.
total of empathy. And I was thinking about what Joe Biden can do in that, and taking moments to just do basically apolitical presidential thank yous to nurses and doctors. Also, summer is coming. And when it's here, people are going to want to be out and about. They're going to start bending the rules. And there's no voice at the national level thanking Americans for doing the hard thing of quarantining, right? Of like thank you for what you're doing. It seems like it's exhausting. You're staying home. It feels like you're not doing anything, but actually you're doing something really important for the country. There's no one really offering that. And that is something that I think Joe Biden can do. And it would contrast with what Trump fails to do. That's all.
Yeah, and look, I mean, it is the end of April, right? He has become the presumptive nominee faster than most, so he's got time. I do think the most important things he can be doing right now are A, raising money, and B, sort of assembling a staff for the general and staffing up and figuring out policy and all that kind of stuff. But, it may turn out to be true that not being Donald Trump is all he needs to win, but like, don't want to bet on that.
No.
and like you said, Lovett, like they do have sort of an ability, because we're in the middle of a pandemic, to control the message a bit more than usual, control what you hear from Biden more than usual when he's just sort of at a rally spouting things off. So you might as well use that advantage to to present the best case for Joe Biden to as many people as possible and reach them where they already are, and instead of trying to turn their attention to the Biden media apparatus. Just find them where they are and present your best case. Just sort of blocking, tackling.
There's also the constant challenge with Donald Trump of him doing 40 offensive things a day, and you can't talk about all of them because then people learn about none of them. And I do think that the Biden campaign can help focus people on the right things, because the problem is if Trump in any way insults the press corps or asks someone to move CNN from the front row to the back row, that's obviously a ridiculous, shitty, offensive thing that shouldn't happen. But the press corps likes nothing more than to report on his attacks on the First Amendment or his criticisms of them, and to retweet how great their colleagues are. Like this story about Trump forcing the West Point cadets to return to campus, to quarantine for 2 weeks, to maybe be alone, to maybe not have their families, is one of the most selfish acts I have ever heard of in my fucking life. Then you're going to deploy these kids overseas to war. He should be talking about that every single day until this bullshit idea is canceled. And like, I'd love to see Biden carrying that message constantly.
Yeah, that is fucking crazy. And it also is like, it is the ideal contrast with Joe Biden, right?
Yes.
who is like very good at showing empathy and helping people.
Whose son
grieve.
served and lost his life. I mean, not related to war, but yeah.
And then versus Donald Trump, who's like putting kids at risk who are already risking their lives to serve their country just so he gets a photo op. Let's dig into Biden's message, particularly as it relates to the economic crisis. He did an interview with Politico's Michael Grunwald, where he was fairly populist and combative in a way I haven't heard in a while from him. He hit the big banks for not lending enough money fast enough to small businesses, saying, quote, "This is the second time we've bailed their asses out," and that, quote, "they're only alive because of the American taxpayer." He said the next economic stimulus bill should be, quote, "a hell of a lot bigger than the last bill, which was $2 trillion. And he used his own management of the 2009 Recovery Act to hit the Trump administration, saying, quote, "There's no coordination, there's no accountability. Come on, the guy waits to hold up money because he wants to make sure his name is on the checks." What do you guys think of this interview and message from Biden? Lovett, what do you think?
It was strong. I mean, it was the most sort of direct and well articulated an argument for the kind of stimulus he would seek would be. It was also I appreciated him coming back to the checkpoint, because it was a little bit of a non sequitur where he dropped it, but he clearly needed to get that in. He wanted to hit Trump on the checks. I do think you see someone trying to strike a more populist note, and that, the conversations he's having with the left and the party, whether it's around these sort of policy groups or his conversations with Bernie or his conversations with his advisors about how he has to shift to appeal to the broadest coalition of Democratic voters, is in there and coming out as he's speaking. Yeah, that's what I thought.
Tommy, what do you think?
I loved hearing it. I loved it. I mean, listen, Democrats, we have this responsibility gene that flows through everything we do and makes us less savvy politically right now. Because I think Democrats understand we need these the CARES Act 1 and 2 to work. We need like massive government intervention to get people back on their feet. And so you don't want to, undercut that process in any way if it'll have long-term ramifications. But it was great to hear Biden calling out bullshit that was in this earliest forms of the relief, right? Like specifically saying we need massive aid to states and cities. That's important, and it's a marker we should lay down, not only to push Trump, but also to push Schumer and Pelosi. He was talking about we got to make sure that cops and firefighters get paid and don't run out of money. He was talking about the lack of oversight. He was saying, of the banks, this is the second time we bailed their asses out. Like, I think that's great. He needs to outflank Trump in terms of populism. If that creates some discomfort for Chuck and Nancy, I'm totally cool with that. I imagine the rest of the Senate or the House Democrats in particular are cool with that because a lot of these deals are getting cut between Pelosi and Mnuchin and Schumer through leadership. So more of this. Do this all the time.
I was really happy to read this. I mean, I think there's two sort of essential messages for the general election for Biden. One, he's already nailed because it was basically his primary campaign message, which is what we saw in that, or what we heard about in that Axios focus group of Obama-Trump voters. Is they want competent leadership. It's not going to divide the country against each other. They want to sort of pull people together. So Biden's got that covered. But there's another essential message that is because of this economic crisis and the rage and despair that so many people are going to be feeling for a long time, who are out of work or have seen their wages cut or don't have health care. And if he can't channel that, he's going to be in trouble. And I think we're now seeing him start to channel that anger in a really important way. And again, hope he does it on television interviews in a whole bunch of different ways instead of just a Politico interview. But, if that's a reflection of what his team's going to look like, his policies, then that's a very good sign. On that note, there is a balance he has to strike. On Thursday, Bloomberg reported that one of the people who Biden has been getting economic advice from is Larry Summers, a veteran of the Clinton and Obama administrations who's managed quite a few economic crises, but it's also viewed by progressives as too centrist and too lax when it comes to regulating the banks. And a number of these groups called on Biden to remove Summers from his list of advisors. How big of a deal do you think the Summers things is? The Summers.
It feels very It feels like a very Twitter-focused controversy. I mean, look, Larry Summers is one of the few people on the planet who has been a part of an effort to rescue an economy. I think it's worth hearing him. But it's also notable that during his time at the White House, Biden's econ guy was someone named Jared Bernstein, who was seen as too progressive, too far to the left. He was criticized by Wall Street. So this would be an opportunity, I think, for Biden to use some of his own channels. Sit down, have a conversation with Jared Bernstein about what should be in the next round of the CARES Act. What do you want to see in it? Flesh out a bunch of progressive priorities in a long and thoughtful way that speaks to what you really believe and want to see happen and gets you around a headline that you dared to call Larry Summers. You don't have to like Larry Summers. A lot of people don't, but he's a smart economist, so maybe give him a call.
What do you think, Lovett? I know you're a huge Larry fan.
I actually, Larry's a very, very smart, very, very strange man. And
you and I have worked with him on speeches. We know
we've worked with him on speeches. You have to. I have sat in a room and tried to I've sat in a room with Larry Summers as he kind of waxes economic and try to take what he's saying and try to translate it into human English. So I've been there. He's one advisor among many. I actually understand why his critics would blow a gasket because he's not just to the right of where they want. He's also really smart and effective about getting his point of view reflected in policy. That said, he's one of a bunch of advisors, and Joe Biden should absolutely be free to talk to a full range of advisors from the far left to the Larry Summers wing and use that to help synthesize the best but also more progressive policy. So I don't see it as a kind of... I just see it as a short-term small controversy, and the way you answer it is, as Tommy said, is by making sure that what you actually advocate for is, in the kind of, let me say it like this, that what you actually end up advocating for is progressive in a way that sort of fulfills the expectations of a lot of people who are getting behind Joe Biden.
There's only a handful of people in the world who have managed governments through economic crises. Larry Summers is one of them. So if you're going to call Larry up as someone who, first of all, he knows them because he worked with them, and someone who has been through economic crises for advice, that's fine if you're just calling them informally for advice. It's very different than him saying like, yeah, he's floating Larry's name for fucking Treasury Secretary, right? Then we can all have our debate about that. But I do think you're right. Like if, the same story said he's still relying on Jared Bernstein and a whole bunch of others. I know the Biden campaign is talking to a lot of progressive groups. This goes back to sort of a conversation we've had before, like, it might be a good idea for Biden to start announcing members of his economic team or people who he's he's going to be relying on advice from in the White House and floating names. And, the Biden campaign can do a lot to sort of allay progressives' fear over this while still saying, yeah, he's going to call a wide range of people for advice sometimes. And that's just how it's going to be.
Yeah, I do think part of this, I think whether it's what he's advocating for in terms of what should be in the next round of stimulus, who he's talking to as he's generating new policies, you kind of see the push and pull of sort of the political challenges of the situation he's in that, people are saying like, where is Joe Biden? Why isn't Joe Biden in the fight? Well, one way he can get more in the fight is having a stronger, more specific set of positions he's advocating for in a stimulus. It can be in announcing policies he would pursue as president and announcing the members of his staff, putting out there that who he's talking to and what he's talking about. Now, that may get him more coverage. That may get people to understand what kind of president it would be. But also with that comes a lot of scrutiny. And some of that scrutiny will have downsides and have risks. So yeah. I think that's sort of the balance.
Yeah, and then like in short of that, though, you could do a little roundtable conversation with Katie Porter, Elizabeth Warren, and Pramila Jayapal, who endorsed today, would offer you a thoughtful, well-informed, progressive view of how to go forward. Let the press hear it, let them cover it, make it part of the conversation about this next package of relief that should come out of Congress, and that would be a net benefit in many ways.
Yeah, maybe Biden even skips it.
All right. On that note, when we come back, we will have Lovett's interview with Senator Brian Schatz. Thanks to Senator Schatz for joining us today, and we will talk to you guys later.
What's up, boys?
What's happening?
Why do we have to? I mean, we guess we can end the show.
We didn't even talk about Alex Azar getting fired. Oh no!
Oh yeah!
Not Alex, not Azar.
Oh,
Azar's.
No, I mean, there's all these floats that he might get fired.
Oh, yeah.
Azar's the one. Azar's responsible. Once Azar's out of here, we'll be smooth sailing. Got to get rid of Azar.
Yeah, well, it's funny because on paper, he actually is qualified. He was deputy HHS secretary under Bush, but he's just such a political hack that it is amazing that he was able to fuck this up so badly. I mean, I love a good labradoodle, but why would you have a dog breeder as your head political guy for 6 years?
Yeah. Sort of barking up the wrong tree with that guy. You know what I mean?
I also felt
should have hit pause.
I felt fairly good that we did not cover any number of the crazy tweets that Donald Trump let loose yesterday. I was watching them on Sunday, and I'm like, you know what? He is desperate for attention now. And it does, I mean, to our point earlier, it does feel even...
Are we doing the show or are we not doing the show? This is getting so meta. Is this an outro?
I think we're in an outro. I think it's a fun, long outro for the true fans.
Well, it's now we're just listing things off that we didn't do. It's the the Nobel tree when he confused the Nobel for the Pulitzer Prize.
That what was going on? He confused the Nobel for the Pulitzer.
And then he spelled Nobel wrong too. I don't know. Who
spelled
the fuck
it
cares,
Noble,
right? We're in the middle of a pandemic. It seems like there are bigger issues. But then what the president's tweeting about every day.
But then he pretended that he meant noble, misspelled, because they are not noble, because they're journalists and they're fake news bad. So he's always right.
Bad stuff, guys. Bad stuff.